The twin-engine Cessna 172 shuddered violently as it dropped through a pocket of turbulent air, the control yoke jerking in the student's hands. From the right seat, flight instructor Brandon Kellerman's jaw tightened, his fingers hovering over his own set of controls, ready to take over at the first sign of incompetence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "You're overcorrecting again, Martinez," Kellerman snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. "How many times do I have to tell you? Smooth inputs. This isn't a video game." In the left seat, 47-year-old Thomas Martinez kept his eyes locked on the horizon, his weathered hands making a subtle adjustment to the yoke. His gray-streaked hair was cut military short, and despite the tension radiating from the instructor beside him, his expression remained calm, almost meditative. "I've got it," Thomas said quietly. "No, you don't," Kellerman shot back. "You haven't got it for the past 12 lessons. I don't know what makes you think today will be any different." What Brandon Kellerman didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the hands gripping that control yoke had once guided a damaged C-130 Hercules through a sandstorm over Kandahar, with one engine on fire and hydraulics failing. Those same hands had brought home crews that should have died in the Afghan mountains. But Thomas Martinez never talked about that. He never talked about any of it. The morning had started like every other at Redwood Valley Regional Airport, a small municipal airfield tucked into the rolling hills of Northern California. The facility was modest, a single runway, a weathered control tower, and a cluster of hangars housing everything from crop dusters to expensive private jets belonging to Silicon Valley executives seeking weekend escapes. Thomas Martinez had arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, just as he had for the past 3 months. He always came early, walking the flight line, inspecting aircraft, absorbing the quiet ritual of pre-dawn aviation. The other students, mostly young men in their 20s, eager to build flight hours toward commercial pilot careers, would stumble in around 7, clutching coffee cups and complaining about early morning ground school. Thomas never complained. He simply showed up, notebook in hand, and waited. The flight school, Skyward Aviation Academy, operated out of a converted maintenance hangar. Inside, the walls were covered with sectional charts, weather briefing stations, and faded photographs of aircraft from decades past. The smell of aviation fuel, coffee, and old paperwork created an oddly comforting atmosphere that reminded Thomas of countless military ready rooms from his past life. Brandon Kellerman, 34 years old, was the school's chief flight instructor and part owner. He had earned his credentials the traditional way: flight school, certified flight instructor rating, then instrument and multi-engine endorsements. He'd logged over 3,000 hours, an impressive number for someone his age, and he wore that accomplishment like armor. Kellerman prided himself on maintaining the highest standards. He was known throughout the regional aviation community as a demanding instructor, one who didn't tolerate mediocrity. His pass rate was lower than other instructors, but he considered that a badge of honor. "I'm not here to make friends," he'd told the owner during his interview. "I'm here to make safe pilots." The problem was that somewhere along the way, Kellerman's pursuit of excellence had curdled into something else, an arrogance that made him believe his way was the only way, and anyone who didn't immediately grasp his teaching methods was simply not cut out for aviation. Thomas Martinez had become Kellerman's pet project in the worst possible way. From their very first lesson, Kellerman had found fault with everything. Thomas's radio communications were too formal, his checklist discipline too rigid, his scan pattern too methodical. "You fly like you're reading a manual," Kellerman had criticized during their 3rd lesson. "Aviation requires feel, intuition. You can't just follow procedures robotically." The irony was lost on Kellerman. Thomas's robotic procedures were survival instincts honed over 23 years in the Air Force, where following procedures meant the difference between bringing your crew home or leaving them scattered across a desert floor. But Thomas never argued, he never defended himself. He simply nodded, made notes in his worn logbook, and came back for the next lesson. The other students had noticed the treatment. In the cramped student lounge where future pilots gathered between lessons to compare notes and war stories, Thomas had become a topic of hushed conversation. "Kellerman's destroying that older guy. I've never seen him that harsh with anyone." "Me seeing that Thomas can handle it, though," Emily Chan added, one of the few female students at the school. "He never gets rattled. I watched him pre-flight yesterday. The most thorough inspection I've ever seen. The guy checks things 3 times. "That's probably why Kellerman hates him. He's too careful, too slow. Kellerman wants cowboys who can feel the airplane, not guys who need a checklist for everything." What none of them knew, what Thomas had never mentioned to a single person at the flight school, was the small wooden box in his apartment containing a distinguished flying cross, an air medal with valor device, and a chest full of other ribbons representing 2 decades of service as a C-130 pilot and later as an instructor pilot for combat cargo operations. Thomas had retired 18 months earlier, taking his discharge papers and modest pension to a small rental house in Redwood Valley. The transition to civilian life had been harder than he had anticipated. The structure of military life, the sense of purpose, the brotherhood, all of it had vanished overnight, leaving him adrift in a world that seemed trivially concerned with things that didn't matter.
Flying had always been his anchor, his meditation. In the cockpit, the noise in his head quieted. The nightmares from Bagram, from missions gone wrong, from friends who didn't come home, all of it faded when he had a yoke in his hands and sky stretching out before him. But military pilots couldn't simply transfer their skills to civilian aviation. The Federal Aviation Administration required everyone, regardless of military experience, to start from scratch. Private pilot certificate, then instrument rating, then commercial, and so on. Thomas understood the reasoning. Civilian flying had different rules, different procedures, different priorities. He accepted it without bitterness. What he hadn't anticipated was Brandon Kellerman. Their personality clash was fundamental. Kellerman valued improvisation and natural feel. Thomas valued discipline and procedural adherence. Kellerman taught through criticism and pressure. Thomas had learned through mentorship and patient repetition. They were oil and water, and every lesson only made the mixture more volatile. On this particular morning, a Thursday in late September, Thomas was scheduled for his stage check, a comprehensive evaluation that would determine whether he was ready to advance to solo cross-country flights. He'd been preparing for weeks, studying weather theory, navigation calculations, emergency procedures. His written exam scores were perfect. His ground school instructor had noted that Thomas Martinez asked more thoughtful questions than students half his age. But none of that mattered to Kellerman. In his mind, Thomas Martinez was a marginal student at best, someone who lacked the natural aptitude for flying and was compensating with excessive caution and over-preparation. As Thomas completed his pre-flight inspection that morning, running his hands along the Cessna's control surfaces, checking fuel levels, testing flight controls, Kellerman watched from the hangar doorway with his arms crossed and an expression of barely concealed impatience. "Are you going to inspect every rivet, Martinez? We've got a schedule to keep." Thomas didn't respond. He finished his inspection with the same methodical care, made a final note in his checklist, and walked over to where Kellerman stood. "Aircraft is ready," Thomas said simply. Kellerman rolled his eyes. "Let's get this over with." They climbed into the Cessna, Thomas taking the left seat, Kellerman the right. As Thomas worked through the engine start checklist, Kellerman's leg bounced impatiently, his fingers drumming on the doorframe. Neither man could have known that this routine training flight was about to become anything but routine. Neither could have predicted that within the next 2 hours, the dynamic between them would shatter completely, revealing truths that would change everything. The engine coughed to life, the propeller spinning into a blur. Thomas keyed the radio microphone, his voice steady and professional as he requested taxi clearance from ground control. And with that transmission, their journey began. A journey that would take them from contempt to crisis, from judgment to revelation, and ultimately from pride to humility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Cessna climbed steadily through 3,500 feet, leaving the patchwork farmland of Redwood Valley behind as they headed toward the practice area, a stretch of empty sky over the coastal hills where student pilots could safely practice maneuvers without worrying about traffic. The morning air was smooth, the visibility unlimited, perfect flying weather. Through the windscreen, Thomas could see the Pacific Ocean glinting in the distance, a thin line of blue separating Earth from sky. "All right, Martinez," Kellerman said, pulling out his valuation clipboard. "Let's start with some basic air work. Show me slow flight, then a power-off stall, followed by steep turns in both directions. And please try to maintain your altitude this time." Thomas acknowledged with a brief nod and began configuring the aircraft. He reduced power, extended flaps incrementally, and brought the Cessna into slow flight, that delicate regime where the airplane teeters on the edge of its performance envelope, requiring constant attention and smooth corrections. Kellerman watched with narrowed eyes, waiting for mistakes. Thomas's inputs were deliberate, perhaps a fraction slower than Kellerman preferred, but technically correct. The altitude held within 10 feet. The heading remained steady. "Adequate," Kellerman muttered, making a note. Now the stall. Thomas methodically worked through the procedure, clearing turns to check for traffic, announcing his intentions over the radio, gradually reducing power while raising the nose. The stall warning horn began its insistent bleat. The controls grew mushy. Then, with a gentle buffet, the Cessna broke into a stall. Thomas's recovery was textbook perfect. Pitch down, full power, level the wings, minimize altitude loss. Within seconds, they were flying normally again. Kellerman said nothing, just made another mark on his clipboard. No praise, no acknowledgement, just silence that felt like criticism. They continued through the evaluation checklist. Steep turns, emergency descents, simulated engine failures. Thomas executed each maneuver with quiet competence, his movements economical and precise. To an objective observer, he would have seemed like a capable pilot demonstrating solid fundamentals. But Kellerman wasn't looking for competence. He was looking for artistry, for that undefinable quality he called natural feel. And in his assessment, Thomas Martinez didn't have it. "You're mechanically sound," Kellerman finally said as they leveled off after the last maneuver. "But you fly like a computer program. There's no finesse, no connection with the aircraft. Aviation isn't just about following steps. It's about becoming one with the aircraft." Thomas absorbed the criticism in silence, his jaw working slightly. He wanted to point out that mechanically sound meant safe, that consistency mattered more than style. But he'd learned long ago that arguing with instructors only made things worse. "Let's head back," Kellerman continued. "We'll do some pattern work, and then we need to have a serious discussion about your progress." The tone in Kellerman's voice made Thomas's stomach tighten. He'd heard that tone before, in his first few weeks at the flight school. It was the tone Kellerman used before telling a student they weren't cut out for flying. Thomas turned the Cessna back toward Redwood Valley, the airport now visible in the distance as a small gray strip carved into the green landscape. He began his descent, running through the pre-landing checklist with his usual thoroughness. That's when they heard it. All aircraft, Redwood Valley Tower." The controller's voice came through their headsets, tight with stress. "Be advised, we have an emergency situation in progress. Redwood Valley Airport is temporarily closed to all traffic. Repeat, airport is closed. All aircraft maintain clear of the Class Delta airspace until further notice." Kellerman sat up straighter, his instructor persona momentarily forgotten. What the hell? Thomas was already reaching for the radio.
Redwood Tower, Cessna 823 Charlie Delta, currently 10 miles northeast at 4,500 feet. Request clarification on the emergency. There was a pause, filled with static and the faint sound of urgent voices in the background. Then the controller came back, and now his voice was barely controlled. 3 Charlie Delta, stand by. We have a situation with a twin-engine aircraft on final. Medical emergency on board. The pilot is incapacitated. Passenger is attempting to land the aircraft with no flight experience. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Kellerman's face went pale. Oh my God! Thomas's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened with sudden focus. His hand moved to the frequency selector, switching to the emergency channel. Tower, 3 Charlie Delta, what type of aircraft? Beechcraft Baron, November 74 Tango Whiskey. Passenger is the pilot's wife. She's panicking. We're trying to talk her through it, but she's never touched the controls before. Through their windscreen, Thomas could now see it. About 5 miles out, a white twin-engine aircraft wobbling through the sky like a drunk bird. Even from this distance, the flight path looked wrong, the wings rocking back and forth as whoever was at the controls struggled to keep the airplane level. Jesus, Kellerman breathed. That Baron's going to auger in. That woman doesn't stand a chance. But Thomas was no longer listening to Kellerman. His mind had shifted into a mode that hadn't been active since his last mission brief at Bagram Air Base. Calm, analytical, focused. He was already calculating angles, distances, wind conditions. He keyed the mic. Redwood Tower, 3 Charlie Delta. I have the Baron in sight. Request permission to provide aerial escort and assistance. Kellerman's head snapped toward him. What? Martinez, what are you doing? The controller's voice came back immediately. 3 Charlie Delta, negative. Maintain clear. We have emergency services on standby. The situation is under control. But Thomas could see that the situation was anything but under control. The Baron was now weaving erratically, its nose pitching up and down as the panicked passenger over-controlled the aircraft. At this rate, she'd either stall it or dive it into the ground before she got anywhere near the runway. Tower, Thomas said, his voice taking on a tone that Kellerman had never heard before. Command authority, absolute and unshakable. That Baron is porpoising. The pilot at the controls is over-controlling in pitch. If she continues this pattern, she will either stall or exceed the aircraft's load limits. I can help. I need you to trust me. There was a longer pause. Then a different voice came on the radio, older, more seasoned. 3 Charlie Delta, this is Redwood Tower Supervisor. Who am I speaking with? Thomas Martinez, sir. Former Air Force, C-130 pilot and instructor pilot, 23 years service. The pause that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Kellerman stared at Thomas as if he'd just announced he was from Mars. Former what? Martinez, you were Air Force? You never said. Thomas held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes never left the struggling Baron. The tower supervisor's voice came back, decision made. 3 Charlie Delta, you're cleared to approach and provide assistance. Use frequency 121.5 to communicate directly with the Baron. Her call sign is November 74 Tango Whiskey. The passenger's name is Jennifer Hayes. Her husband collapsed about 15 minutes ago. She's terrified. Copy that, Tower. 3 Charlie Delta is moving to assist. Thomas banked the Cessna smoothly, pointing it toward the Baron. His movements now had a confidence and precision that seemed to come from nowhere. This wasn't the hesitant student pilot Kellerman had been criticizing all morning. This was someone else entirely. Martinez, what the hell is going on? Kellerman demanded, his voice rising. You can't just... We're in the middle of a check ride. This isn't our problem. Thomas switched frequencies and keyed the mic, ignoring Kellerman completely. November 7-4 Tango Whiskey. This is the Cessna off your right side. Jennifer, my name is Thomas Martinez. I'm a pilot, and I'm here to help you. Can you hear me?" A woman's voice came through the headset, high-pitched and broken with sobs. Oh God, please help me. I don't know what I'm doing. My husband, he collapsed. I don't know how to fly. I'm going to crash. I'm going to die." "Jennifer, listen to me," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute calm. "You're not going to crash. You're not going to die. I'm right here with you, and we're going to get you on the ground safely. But I need you to take a deep breath and listen very carefully to what I tell you. Can you do that for me?" Thomas maneuvered the Cessna closer, pulling alongside the Baron at a safe distance. He could see into the cockpit now, a woman with blonde hair, her face streaked with tears, both hands white-knuckled on the yoke. In the right seat, a man was slumped forward against his harness, unconscious.
Beside him, Kellerman had gone silent, his face a mixture of shock and confusion as he watched his marginal student take command of a life-or-death emergency with the confidence of a combat veteran. The crisis had arrived, unexpected and undeniable, and Thomas Martinez, the student pilot who couldn't seem to satisfy his instructor's expectations, was about to reveal exactly who he really was. The two aircraft flew in formation now, separated by 100 feet of air. The Cessna steady and controlled, the Baron still wobbling like a leaf in a windstorm. Through the side window, Thomas could see Jennifer Hayes's terror-stricken face, her eyes wide and unfocused, her movements jerky and panicked. "Jennifer," Thomas said into the mic, his voice carrying that same unshakable calm. "First thing, I need you to loosen your grip on the yoke. You're strangling it. The airplane doesn't need that much pressure. Just hold it gently, like you're holding a baby bird. Not tight enough to hurt it, but firm enough that it doesn't fly away." I can't. It keeps moving," Jennifer's voice cracked. "Everything's shaking." "That's because you're fighting the airplane," Thomas explained patiently. "When you pull back hard, the nose goes up. Then you get scared and push forward hard, and the nose drops. You're creating the problem you're trying to fix. I need you to relax your arms. Let the airplane tell you what it wants to do." Beside Thomas, Kellerman had found his voice again, and it was laced with anger and disbelief. "Martinez, this is insane! You can't coach someone through landing a Baron. That's a complex aircraft. She needs to divert to a bigger airport with emergency equipment, or better yet, just punch out if she's got a parachute system." Thomas ignored him, his eyes fixed on the Baron. "Jennifer, you're doing great. Now, I need you to look at the instrument panel. Do you see the artificial horizon? It looks like a little airplane with a line through it." I think so, yes." "Good. Keep that little airplane's wings level with the line. When the wings on the instrument tilt, you tilt the yoke the opposite direction to level them out. Small movements, very small." Kellerman grabbed Thomas's shoulder. "Martinez, this is insane. You can't coach someone through landing a Baron. That's a complex aircraft. She needs to divert to a bigger airport with emergency equipment, or better yet, just punch out if she's got a parachute system." Thomas ignored him, his eyes fixed on the Baron. "Jennifer, you're doing great. Now, I need you to look at the airspeed indicator, the one that looks like a speedometer. What number do you see?" 140? 150? It keeps changing." "That's okay. I need you to gently, and I mean very gently, pull back on the throttles. Those are the two levers between the seats. Just ease them back about an inch." "Which levers? There are so many." Thomas's jaw tightened fractionally, the first sign of concern breaking through his calm exterior. A Baron had dozens of controls, and asking a non-pilot to identify anything in the cockpit while panicking and trying to fly was like asking someone to perform surgery while blindfolded. From the Redwood Valley Tower, the supervisor's voice cut in. 3 Charlie Delta, we have paramedics standing by for the pilot. What's your assessment of the situation? Before Thomas could respond, Kellerman grabbed the mic from its holder, his face flushed. Tower, this is Brandon Kellerman, certified flight instructor aboard 3 Charlie Delta. I need to report that this situation is being handled improperly. The pilot assisting is a student under my instruction and is not qualified to... Thomas's hand shot out and ripped the mic from Kellerman's grasp with a speed that made the instructor flinch. The look Thomas gave him could have stripped paint. If you touch this radio again, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, I will declare you a hazard to flight safety and land this airplane right now, leaving that woman up there with nobody to help her. Do you understand me? Kellerman's mouth opened and closed like a fish. In all his years of instructing, of commanding his little kingdom of the cockpit, no one had ever spoken to him like this. No student had ever dared. You can't talk to me that way. I'm the pilot in command of this aircraft. I'm the instructor. You're just... I'm the only thing standing between Jennifer Hayes and a smoking crater. Now shut up and let me work. He keyed the mic again, forcing his voice back into that tone of supernatural calm. Jennifer, forget the throttles for now. Let's focus on keeping you level. You're doing fine. The airplane wants to fly. You just have to let it. The 2 aircraft continued their strange dance across the sky. Below them, Redwood Valley had become a hub of controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles were staging near the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, their lights painting the tarmac in reds and whites. People had gathered outside the terminal, faces turned skyward, phones raised to record what might become either a miracle or a tragedy. In the tower, Supervisor Robert Chen stood with his hand pressed against the glass, watching the 2 aircraft. He'd been a controller for 32 years, had talked pilots through emergencies before, but never anything like this. The student pilot, no, the former military pilot in the Cessna, was doing something remarkable. But Chen couldn't shake the gnawing worry that it wouldn't be enough.
Should we divert her to Sacramento? Asked the younger controller beside him. They've got longer runways, better equipment. Chen shook his head slowly. She'd never make it. She's barely maintaining control now. Another 30 minutes of this and she'll either stall it or lose her mind completely. Martinez is right. We have to get her down here, and we have to do it soon. Back in the Cessna, Kellerman had retreated into a stunned silence, pressed against his door as far from Thomas as the small cockpit would allow. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile everything he thought he knew with what was unfolding before him. This man, this mediocre student who couldn't hold altitude within 100 feet during basic maneuvers, was maintaining perfect formation with the distressed aircraft while simultaneously coaching a terrified non-pilot through the fundamentals of flight. The precision of his flying, the authority in his voice, the absolute command presence. It was like watching a completely different person wearing Thomas Martinez's face. How long were you Air Force? Kellerman finally asked, his voice small. Not now, Thomas replied, not taking his eyes off the Baron. 23 years, you said. What did you fly? Kellerman, I swear to God. Just tell me. Kellerman pressed, something desperate creeping into his voice. Just tell me who you are. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his hands making microscopic corrections to keep the Cessna in perfect position. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were reading from someone else's biography. C-130 Hercules, cargo and personnel transport. Combat zones mostly. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. I was an instructor pilot for the last 8 years. Trained pilots to fly tactical approaches into hot landing zones. Trained them to bring their birds home when half the systems were shot to hell and they were running on fumes and prayer. He paused, then added quietly. Trained them to stay calm when everything was going wrong, because panic kills faster than enemy fire. Kellerman felt something collapse inside his chest, some structure of ego and certainty that he'd built his entire professional identity upon. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell anyone at the school?" "Because it doesn't matter," Thomas said simply. "FAA says I start from zero, so I start from zero. My old life doesn't get me any special treatment, doesn't make the regulations go away." "But I've been treating you like you're some kind of incompetent amateur, like you don't know what you're doing." Thomas allowed himself the ghost of a smile, though there was no humor in it. "You've been teaching me civilian procedures. Different world, different rules. I accepted that." "Jennifer," Thomas said into the radio, his attention snapping back to the immediate crisis, "I need you to do something for me. Look outside, not at the instruments. See the ground below you? I want you to very gently push the yoke forward just a tiny bit. We're going to start descending toward the airport." "No!" Jennifer's voice shot up an octave. "No! If I go down, I'll crash!" "You won't crash because I'm right here with you," Thomas said firmly. "Jennifer, I've done this 1,000 times. I've talked pilots through worse situations than this in the middle of sandstorms with people shooting at us. Trust me, I will not let you fall." The Baron's nose dipped slightly, beginning a tentative descent. "That's perfect," Thomas encouraged. "You're doing exactly what I need you to do. You're a natural at this." Kellerman watched the altimeter wind down. 4,000 feet, 3,800 feet, 3,600 feet. Thomas was bringing both aircraft down together, maintaining perfect spacing, his flying so smooth it seemed effortless. And in that moment, Brandon Kellerman realized with crushing clarity that he'd been teaching a master how to paint by numbers. At 2,500 feet, the Baron hit a pocket of turbulence. The aircraft lurched sideways, its wing dipping sharply to the left. Through the Cessna's window, Thomas watched Jennifer's silhouette jerk in her seat, her hands yanking the yoke in the wrong direction. "Wings level, Jennifer." Thomas's voice cut through sharply, abandoning gentleness for command. "Right yoke, now." The Baron's wing dipped further, the aircraft entering the beginning of a spiral. At this altitude, with an inexperienced pilot, a spiral could become a death sentence in seconds. The increasing bank would lead to increased back pressure, which would tighten the spiral, which would increase the descent rate until the aircraft was in an unrecoverable dive. "Jennifer, listen to my voice. Turn the yoke right. Turn it right now." "I am! I am!" Her scream came through the headset, raw with terror. Thomas could see the problem immediately. She was pulling back while turning, exactly the wrong instinct. The Baron's nose pitched up, even as it continued to roll, the aircraft shuddering as it approached a stall in the turn. "Stop pulling back," Thomas commanded. "Push forward and turn right. Trust me, push forward." Every instinct a non-pilot had would scream against pushing forward when you were already descending, already feeling like you were falling. It went against every survival reflex, but it was the only thing that would save her. For a heart-stopping moment, the Baron continued its roll, the bank angle reaching 45 degrees. Then, miraculously, the wing started to level. Jennifer had done it, had fought against her own instincts and followed the voice in her ear. The Baron wallowed back to something approximating level flight, still descending, still unstable, but no longer in an incipient death spiral. Oh God, I almost killed us. I almost—" "No," Thomas interrupted, his voice firm but warmer now. "You saved yourself. You listened and you did exactly what needed to be done. That took courage, Jennifer. Real courage."
Beside him, Kellerman had gone completely white, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. He'd watched enough aviation accident reports to know exactly how close they'd just come to disaster. If Thomas had hesitated even 2 seconds longer, or if Jennifer hadn't responded— "How did you know she'd respond?" Kellerman asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know she wouldn't just freeze?" Thomas's eyes never left the Baron. "I didn't, but sometimes you have to demand more from people than they think they can give. Fear paralyzes, but purpose focuses. I gave her something to do, something specific. Action beats panic every time." The airport was now clearly visible ahead. Runway 16, a strip of concrete 4,200 feet long and 75 feet wide, carved into the valley floor. To an experienced pilot, it was more than adequate. To a non-pilot in a twin-engine aircraft, it might as well have been a tightrope stretched across the Grand Canyon. Thomas keyed the tower frequency. Redwood Tower, 3 Charlie Delta, we're established on a long straight-in approach to runway 16. I'm going to need you to clear all traffic and keep this frequency silent except for emergency communications. 3 Charlie Delta, frequency is yours, Chen responded immediately. All equipment is standing by. Winds are calm. Altimeter 30.12. You're cleared to land any runway, any direction. The open-ended clearance was the controller's way of saying, do whatever you need to do, however you need to do it. The rulebook was suspended. Survival was the only priority. Thomas glanced at his altimeter, 2,000 feet and descending. He needed to get Jennifer configured for landing, which meant talking her through extending flaps, adjusting power, and maintaining a stable descent rate. Each task was simple in isolation, but potentially catastrophic if done incorrectly or in the wrong sequence. Jennifer, I need you to look between the seats again. Find the lever that has a handle shaped like a wing. It might have markings that say flaps. Can you see it? There are so many levers. I don't know which one. Thomas fought down a spike of frustration. In a Baron, the flap lever was clearly marked. But to someone who'd never been in a cockpit before, the array of controls must look like the dashboard of an alien spacecraft. Okay, different approach, Thomas said, his mind racing. Look at your husband's side. Is his hand near any levers? There was a pause. Yes, his hand is resting on something. It has a little picture of a wing on it. Perfect. That's your flap control. Don't move it yet. Just put your hand on it so you're ready. Thomas checked the Baron's position. They were now at 1,500 feet, about 3 miles from the runway threshold. In a normal landing, he'd be fully configured by now, flaps extended, gear down, speed reduced to final approach numbers. But nothing about this was normal. Jennifer, what's your airspeed showing? 120? 130? Too fast for landing, but not dangerously so. Thomas made a decision. Better to land hot and fast than to slow down too much and risk a stall. They could use the entire runway length if needed. That's good. We're going to leave the speed right there. Now I need you to pull that flap lever back just a tiny bit, maybe an inch. The airplane will pitch down when you do. That's normal. Just let it happen. He watched the Baron carefully. When Jennifer moved the flap lever, the aircraft's nose dropped sharply, more sharply than it should have. She'd pulled more flaps than he'd asked for, probably in the neighborhood of 15 degrees instead of the initial 10. Throttles forward, Thomas snapped. Push those levers between the seats forward. The Baron's descent rate had increased dramatically with the added drag. Without adding power, she'd be in the dirt a mile short of the runway. Thomas heard the engine spool up, the Baron's nose rising slightly as Jennifer added power. Too much power. The aircraft began climbing instead of descending. Back! Pull them back! Thomas called. Just a little. This was the deadly dance. Every input creating a reaction that required another input to correct. Each correction potentially creating a new problem. It was like trying to balance on a bicycle while someone kept pushing you from different directions. Kellerman leaned forward, watching the Baron's erratic flight path. She's all over the place. She's going to auger in. No, she's not, Thomas said with absolute certainty. Jennifer, you're doing great. I know it feels crazy right now, but you're learning to fly. Small inputs, everything small and gentle. At 1,000 feet, the Baron's flight path had stabilized somewhat. The nose was pointed at the runway, the wings mostly level, the descent rate controlled. It wasn't pretty, but it was survivable. Then Thomas saw something that made his blood run cold. The landing gear. In all the chaos, with all the focus on keeping the aircraft flying, neither he nor Jennifer had extended the landing gear. The Baron was descending toward a runway at 120 knots with its wheels still retracted, setting up for a catastrophic belly landing that would likely tear the aircraft apart and potentially spark a fire. "Jennifer," Thomas said, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the adrenaline now flooding his system, "I need you to find another lever. This one will have a picture of a wheel on it. It might be on the floor between the seats, or it might be on the panel. Can you see it?" "I'm looking. I don't. There are so many things." They were at 800 feet now, less than a minute from touchdown. If the gear wasn't down and locked before they reached the runway, it would all be over.
Thomas could feel Kellerman's panic breathing beside him. The instructor had finally grasped the full weight of the situation. This wasn't a training exercise or a theoretical emergency. This was real, and if it went wrong, a woman was going to die while they watched helplessly from 100 feet away. "Jennifer, I need you to trust me," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute authority. "Stop looking around. Close your eyes." "What? No, I can't." "Close your eyes," Thomas repeated. "Right now." He waited 2 seconds, watching the Baron's flight path remain relatively stable despite Jennifer not looking outside. "Now, keep your eyes closed and reach down with your right hand. Feel the floor between the seats. There should be a lever there, separate from the others. It's big, it's mechanical, and it moves up and down. Do you feel it?" I think so. Yes. That's your landing gear lever. Pull it down. Pull it all the way down until it stops, and you hear a sound like something locking." Thomas held his breath. The Baron was at 600 feet, half a mile from the runway threshold. He heard the change in the aircraft's sound even through the Cessna's cockpit. The rumble and thunk of landing gear extending and locking into place. 3 green lights would be illuminating on Jennifer's instrument panel, though she probably had no idea what they meant. "Okay, open your eyes," Thomas said. "You just put the landing gear down. You're ready to land." "I'm going to crash," Jennifer whispered, her voice breaking. "Thomas, I can't do this. I can't." The runway filled the windscreen now, a strip of gray concrete rushing up to meet them. The Baron was descending through 400 feet, committed to the landing whether Jennifer believed she could do it or not. And Thomas knew that the next 60 seconds would determine whether he'd just witnessed the birth of a miracle or presided over a tragedy. Everything came down to this moment. Everything. "Jennifer, look at me." Thomas's voice cut through her panic like a blade through fog. "Look at my airplane. Can you see me?" Through her tears, Jennifer turned her head. There, impossibly close, was the Cessna. Steady, controlled, its wings perfectly level. She could see the man in the left seat, his face calm, his hands relaxed on the controls. "I see you," she whispered. "Good. Now I want you to pretend your airplane is connected to mine by an invisible string. Wherever I go, you go. Whatever I do, you do. You don't have to think about the runway. You don't have to think about landing. Just follow me. Can you do that?" I'll try." "That's all I need," Thomas said. Then, without hesitation, he banked the Cessna slightly right, positioning himself directly alongside the Baron, matching its speed and descent rate exactly. Kellerman's intake of breath was audible. "Martinez, what are you doing? You're too close. If she drifts even 10 feet? "She won't," Thomas said simply. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as one of the most extraordinary displays of airmanship ever seen at Redwood Valley Regional Airport. Thomas Martin began flying a formation approach with an uncontrolled aircraft piloted by someone who didn't know how to fly. The 2 aircraft descended as if tethered together, the Cessna rock steady, the Baron wobbling but holding position. Thomas made every movement deliberate and visible, narrating each one so Jennifer could understand what was happening. "I'm reducing my power just a touch," Thomas said calmly, pulling back gently on the throttle. "The nose will drop slightly. Match me." The Baron's nose dropped. "Perfect.
Now we're both at the same angle. See how that works? They crossed the runway threshold at 200 feet, both aircraft perfectly aligned with the center line. Below them, emergency vehicles tracked their approach, crews standing ready. In the tower, Robert Chen watched with his heart hammering in his chest. He's going to land alongside her. He's going to show her how to do it. At 100 feet, Thomas began his final coaching. Jennifer, in about 10 seconds, I'm going to start pulling back gently on the yoke. The nose will come up, and we'll slow down. When my wheels touch the ground, you do the same thing. Gentle pullback. Let the airplane settle. Don't force it down. Okay. Jennifer's voice was steadier now, focused on the task of simply mimicking the aircraft she was following. 50 feet. Thomas's voice remained that same preternatural calm, starting to pull back now. Nose coming up. Just like me. 30 feet. The Cessna's nose rose, its descent rate decreasing. Beside it, the Baron's nose rose too, Jennifer's hands moving in unconscious synchronization with the aircraft she was following. 20 feet. Almost there. Keep it coming back. Smooth. 10 feet. The emergency vehicles began rolling alongside the runway, keeping pace with the descending aircraft. 5 feet. Thomas's main wheels kissed the concrete with barely a chirp, a landing so smooth it seemed like the airplane had simply decided to stop flying and start rolling. And 3 seconds later, with Thomas calling, "Now, hold it off," the Baron's main gear touched down. The landing wasn't graceful. The aircraft bounced once, settled, bounced again smaller, and then finally committed to the runway. But the gear held. The aircraft stayed on the center line. Jennifer was down. "Brakes," Thomas called. "Gently press the top of the rudder pedals." The Baron began to slow, its trajectory wavering slightly, but staying on the pavement. Thomas kept the Cessna rolling alongside, matching speeds, maintaining that invisible connection until both aircraft were traveling at walking pace. "You can stop now, Jennifer," Thomas said softly. "You're safe. You did it."
The Baron rolled to a complete stop halfway down the runway. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the pilot's side door burst open and Jennifer Hayes half fell, half jumped from the cockpit, her legs giving out as she hit the pavement. She collapsed onto her hands and knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Emergency medical technicians swarmed the aircraft, some attending to Jennifer, others climbing into the cockpit to reach her husband. Within seconds, they had him on a backboard, carrying him toward a waiting ambulance. Thomas taxied the Cessna clear of the runway, following the marshaller's directions to a parking spot near the terminal. When he shut down the engine, the sudden silence was deafening. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Kellerman sat frozen in his seat, staring straight ahead through the windscreen at nothing in particular. Finally, Thomas began the post-flight checklist: mixture to cut off, magnetos off, master switch off. The same methodical process he'd followed 1,000 times before. "That," Kellerman said hoarsely, "was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever seen." Thomas said nothing, just continued securing the aircraft. "You flew formation with an uncontrolled aircraft," Kellerman continued, his voice rising with something between awe and hysteria. "You coached a non-pilot through a landing in a complex aircraft. My God, Martinez, who are you?" Thomas finished the checklist and sat back, his hands resting on his knees. When he spoke, his voice carried a bone-deep weariness. "I'm someone who's done hard things before," he said quietly. "That's all." "That's all?" Kellerman's voice cracked. "That wasn't just skill, Martinez. That was art. That was mastery. And I've spent 3 months telling you that you don't have what it takes to be a pilot." Thomas turned to look at his instructor for the first time since they'd landed. His eyes were tired, but there was no anger in them, no triumph, just a profound sadness. You were teaching me civilian procedures, and I was learning them. Those are the rules now. I accepted that. But you're already a pilot. You've been a pilot longer than I've been alive. Not according to the FAA. To them, I'm a student. So, I became a student. Kellerman felt something crack inside his chest, some fundamental understanding of himself and his place in the world. He'd spent years building his reputation as a demanding instructor, someone who maintained the highest standards. He'd taken pride in his rigor, in his refusal to accept anything less than what he considered excellence. But now, sitting in this small aircraft, beside a man who had just saved a life with nothing but his voice and his experience, Kellerman realized what his high standards really were. Ego masquerading as excellence, gatekeeping disguised as quality control. I failed you, Kellerman said quietly. You didn't fail my check ride. I failed you as an instructor. Thomas opened the door and climbed out of the Cessna, his movements stiff from the tension of the past hour. Kellerman followed, his legs unsteady. A crowd had gathered near the terminal, students, instructors, airport staff, all of them watching with expressions of disbelief. When Thomas stepped onto the tarmac, someone began clapping. Then another person joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire crowd was applauding, the sound echoing across the airfield. Thomas stood uncomfortably, clearly unused to attention. He raised a hand in awkward acknowledgement, then started walking toward the flight school office. Before he'd made 10 steps, a black SUV with government plates screaming onto the ramp, followed by 2 more vehicles. Men in military uniforms emerged, led by a woman in an Air Force officer's service dress, a colonel, based on the eagles on her shoulders. She walked directly to Thomas, came to attention, and saluted. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hendricks, Air Force Base Operations, Travis FB. Sir, I need you to come with me. We have some questions about what just happened here. Thomas returned the salute tiredly. I'm not active duty anymore, Colonel. Haven't been for 18 months. I'm aware of your status, sir, but when former Air Force Master Sergeant David Hayes collapsed in his aircraft and his wife made a distress call, and when a civilian pilot talked her through a landing that our tower supervisor says was impossible, certain people became very interested in who that civilian pilot was. She paused, then added, those people became even more interested when we pulled your service record, Captain Martinez. Kellerman, who had been standing a few feet away, felt his knees go weak. Captain? You said you were a corporal. Thomas glanced back at him, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. I was. Started as enlisted, crew chief on C-130s. The Air Force put me through flight school when I was 28. Flew cargo for 15 years. Made captain 2 years before I retired. And the instructor pilot position? Hendricks added, looking at her tablet. Commander 774th Expeditionary Airlift Squadron, responsible for training pilots in combat approach procedures, tactical landings, and emergency operations in hostile environments. 347 combat missions, 2 distinguished flying crosses, an Air Medal with Valor device. The crowd had gone silent, everyone listening to the recitation of Thomas's service record. "Oh my God," someone whispered. Kellerman felt his face burning with shame. For 3 months, he had been teaching combat maneuvers to a man who had done them for real while being shot at. He'd been correcting the procedures of someone who had written procedures for the Air Force. He'd been criticizing the flying of a decorated combat veteran. And Thomas had never said a word, had never defended himself, just quietly accepted the criticism and kept showing up for lessons.
"Sir," Colonel Hendricks said to Thomas, "Master Sergeant Hayes is stable. The paramedics say his wife's actions saved his life. Keeping the aircraft flying until help arrived gave them time to reach him. His wife credits you with saving both of them. She's asking to meet you once she's recovered from the shock." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'm glad they're both okay." "There's going to be some media interest in this," Hendricks continued. "A civilian pilot talking a non-pilot through a landing makes for compelling news. When that civilian pilot turns out to be a highly decorated combat veteran, it becomes a national story. I'm authorized to offer you public affairs support if you'd like to avoid the attention." "I would," Thomas said immediately. "I just want to finish my training and get my license. That's all I've ever wanted." Hendricks nodded and gestured toward the SUVs. "We still need a full debrief on the incident, if you'll come with us." As Thomas walked toward the vehicles, Kellerman found his voice. "Martinez, wait." Thomas stopped and turned. Kellerman struggled to find words adequate to the moment, to the massive realization crushing down on him. Finally, he simply said, "I'm sorry. For everything. You deserved better." Thomas studied his instructor for a long moment. Then he walked back and extended his hand. "You were doing your job," Thomas said quietly, "teaching me the rules I need to know. No hard feelings." Kellerman shook his hand, tears stinging his eyes. "When you come back, I'd like to continue your training, if you'll have me as your instructor." Thomas smiled, a real smile this time, warm and genuine. "I'd like that." Then he turned and walked toward the waiting vehicles, just another gray-haired man in a worn jacket, disappearing into the bureaucratic machinery of government debriefing. But everyone watching knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a rescue, not just masterful flying. They'd witnessed what true mastery looked like when it operated without ego, without need for recognition, without anything but the quiet certainty that comes from having done hard things before and being willing to do them again. 3 weeks later, Thomas Martinez walked into the flight school on a crisp October morning. The air smelled of coffee and aviation fuel, the same combination that had greeted him every morning for the past 4 months, but something felt different now. The usual cluster of students in the lounge went quiet when he entered, then erupted in greetings and congratulations. Word had spread despite Thomas's best efforts to avoid attention. The local news had run the story. Veteran pilot saves lives in dramatic mid-air rescue. And though Thomas had declined all interview requests, his face had been on television for 3 consecutive nights. "Mr. Martinez," Emily Chen, the student he'd occasionally nodded to in passing, approached with a logbook in hand. "I know you probably don't have time, but could you sign this? You're kind of a legend around here now." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just a student, same as you." "Not quite the same," Jake Peterson chimed in with a grin. "Most of us haven't talked someone through landing a twin-engine aircraft while flying formation with them." Thomas signed Emily's logbook with a simple T. Martinez and excused himself, heading toward the instructor offices. Through the glass window, he could see Brandon Kellerman at his desk, standing at a computer screen but clearly not reading whatever was on it. Thomas knocked softly on the doorframe. Kellerman looked up, and his expression transformed. Relief, anxiety, and something that looked like shame all competing for dominance. He stood immediately. "Martinez? Thomas. Come in, please." The office was small, cramped with aviation manuals, charts, and the detritus of a busy instructor's life. Kellerman gestured to the only other chair, moving a stack of sectional charts to make room. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," Kellerman said once they were both seated. "After everything that happened, after the way I treated you, I thought you might transfer to another instructor, maybe another school entirely." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'm here to finish what I started, if you're still willing to teach me." Kellerman let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "I am. But first, I owe you more than a simple apology. I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about everything I did wrong, and it's a long list." "Kellerman. Brandon, please, call me Brandon." Thomas nodded slowly. Brandon leaned forward, his hands clasped together. I got into instructing because I love flying. I wanted to pass that on to other people. But somewhere along the way, I started believing that my way was the only way. That if someone didn't fly exactly how I thought they should, they were wrong. He paused, gathering his thoughts. You came to me as a student, and I should have asked about your background, should have understood your experience. Instead, I saw someone older, someone methodical, and I assumed that meant you were slow, overcautious, lacking instinct. You were teaching FAA procedures. That's what I needed to learn. No, Brandon shook his head firmly. I was criticizing you for having discipline, for following checklists, for being thorough, all the things that actually make someone a safe pilot. I was teaching you to fly like me instead of helping you adapt your considerable skills to civilian aviation. He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. This is your training record. I went back through every lesson, every evaluation note I wrote, and you know what I realized? You never failed anything, not once. Every maneuver was performed to standards, every procedure was correct. The only thing you failed was matching my personal preferences for how things should feel. Thomas remained silent, letting Brandon continue.
That formation approach you flew? Brandon's voice grew thick with emotion. The way you talked Jennifer Hayes through that landing? I've been flying for 12 years and I couldn't have done that. Most airline captains couldn't have done that. It required a level of skill and composure that only comes from experience I can't even imagine. He met Thomas's eyes. You're not my student. You never were. You're a master pilot working through a bureaucratic requirement, and instead of respecting that, I made you jump through hoops to satisfy my ego. Brandon, Thomas said gently, you're being too hard on yourself. You didn't know. I didn't ask, Brandon countered. That's the problem. I made assumptions instead of asking questions. I saw what I expected to see instead of what was actually in front of me. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where a Cessna was taxiing for departure. I submitted a formal incident report to the FAA and the flight school owner about my conduct during the emergency, about how I tried to stop you from helping, about how I attempted to assert authority over a situation I didn't understand. Thomas's eyebrows rose. That wasn't necessary. It was completely necessary. Brandon turned back. I learned something that day, Thomas. I learned that real authority doesn't come from a certificate on the wall or a title. It comes from competence, from experience, from knowing when to lead and when to follow. He returned to his desk and pulled out another document. This is my recommendation to the FAA that you be granted your private pilot certificate. Your stage check was completed the moment you landed that Cessna alongside Jennifer's Baron. Any instructor in the country would sign you off based on that demonstration alone. Thomas took the document, scanning it quickly. The language was formal but effusive, describing his performance in terms Brandon never used during their training. There's something else, Brandon continued. The owner of Skyward Aviation has asked me to develop a new training module. It's going to be called Flight Discipline and Decision Making. It's based on what I observed from you. The checklist discipline, the calm under pressure, the ability to assess and prioritize in emergencies. He smiled ruefully. I'm going to teach other instructors the very things I criticized you for. The irony isn't lost on me. Thomas set the document on the desk. I appreciate this, Brandon. I really do. But I still need to complete my training. Solo cross countries, night flying, all of it. Can we do that? Absolutely, Brandon said immediately. But this time, I'm going to approach it differently. I want to learn from you as much as you learn from me. Deal? Thomas extended his hand. Deal. 2 months later, on a cold December morning, Thomas Martinez stood before an FAA examiner for his private pilot check ride. The examiner, a retired airline captain named Robert Walsh, had reviewed Thomas's logbook with particular interest. I see you had quite an eventful training period, Walsh commented dryly. You could say that, Thomas replied. The oral examination was thorough but fair. Walsh asked complex scenario questions, probing not just Thomas's knowledge, but his judgment and decision-making. Thomas answered each question with the same methodical care he brought to everything, drawing on decades of experience without explicitly referencing it. The flight portion was anticlimactic after everything that had happened. Thomas flew with precision and confidence, each maneuver executed to standards that exceeded requirements. When they landed and shut down the aircraft, Walsh turned to him with an expression of professional respect. Captain Martinez, using Thomas's military rank deliberately, on behalf of the Federal Aviation Administration, I'm pleased to inform you that you've passed your private pilot practical test. Congratulations. He handed Thomas a temporary certificate, the plastic card that would serve until the permanent one arrived in the mail. You know, I've been examining pilots for 20 years. I've seen thousands of check rides, but I've never examined someone with your background starting from scratch. That takes a special kind of humility. Thomas accepted the certificate, staring at it for a long moment. It was just a piece of paper, a bureaucratic necessity, but it represented something more. A new beginning, a bridge between his old life and whatever came next. Thank you, Thomas said simply. That evening, Skyward Aviation held an informal celebration in the flight school lounge. Students and instructors gathered, and when Thomas arrived, he was surprised to see Jennifer and David Hayes there as well. David, recovered from what turned out to be a severe cardiac event, walked over with his wife. Both had tears in their eyes. "Mr. Martinez," Jennifer began, her voice breaking, "I never got to properly thank you. You saved my life. You saved David's life. I don't have words for what that means." I embraced them both, his own eyes misting. "You saved your husband by keeping that airplane flying, Jennifer. You did that, not me. I just gave you a little guidance." "A little guidance?" David laughed through his tears. "The tower recording has you coaching her through 17 minutes of flight, talking her down from panic, getting the gear extended with 30 seconds to spare. That wasn't guidance, that was a miracle." Brandon approached with a small box in his hands. "Thomas, we wanted to give you something. It's not much, but it felt appropriate." Inside the box was a wooden plaque. Engraved on a brass plate were the words, "Thomas Martinez, Private Pilot Certificate, December 15, 2024. True mastery is quiet, competent, and present when needed most." Below that, in smaller text, "In recognition of extraordinary airmanship and selfless service." Thomas ran his fingers over the engraving, blinking back emotion. "Thank you. All of you." Emily Chen raised a cup of coffee and toast. "To Captain Martinez, the best student pilot we've ever had." "To Thomas," the group echoed, raising their own cups.
As the celebration continued around him, Thomas found himself standing at the window, looking out at the darkened flight line. The runway lights stretched into the distance, and somewhere beyond them, the night sky waited, infinite and full of possibility. He'd come to this flight school 18 months after retirement, lost and searching for purpose. He'd endured criticism and doubt, had been told repeatedly that he didn't have what it took. He'd absorbed it all without complaint, without defense, simply doing the work and showing up each day. And in the moment when it mattered most, when a life hung in the balance, all of that experience, all those years of training and combat missions and hard lessons learned had been there waiting, ready to be called upon. Brandon joined him at the window. "What's next for you?" Thomas smiled. "Instrument rating? Then commercial? Then flight instructor." "Flight instructor?" Brandon looked surprised. "You want to teach?" "I think I have some things to pass on. Lessons about patience, about discipline, about staying humble even when you know you're right." He glanced at Brandon. "About how the best instructors help students become the best versions of themselves, not copies of their teacher." Brandon nodded slowly, understanding the gentle lesson in those words. "I'd be honored to continue as your instructor if you'll have me. I'd like that. We'll learn together." Outside, a Cessna taxied past, its navigation lights blinking red and green in the darkness. Inside that aircraft, another student was beginning their journey, struggling with the same challenges, facing the same doubts that every pilot confronts. And somewhere there were instructors
who either build them up or tear them down, who either recognize potential or miss it completely, who would either teach with humility or with arrogance. Thomas Martinez hoped that what happened at Redwood Valley Regional Airport that day would remind at least a few instructors that mastery often comes in unexpected packages, that quiet competence is more valuable than loud confidence, and that sometimes the student has as much to teach as the instructor has to learn. He finished his coffee and turned back to the celebration, ready to share stories and laughter with people who had become more than fellow students. They had become friends, united by their shared love of flight and their collective witness to something extraordinary. The heroes, Thomas had learned long ago, aren't always the ones with the medals on their walls and the stories on their lips. Sometimes the heroes are the ones who show up every day, who do the hard work without recognition, who wait patiently for the moment when their skills are needed. And when that moment comes, they simply do what needs to be done, quietly, competently, and without expectation of praise. Because that's what heroes do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.